house at the end of Mercer Lane had been empty for 17 years. Yet every night at exactly 3:47 a.m., a single light would flicker on in the upstairs window, burn steadily for 11 minutes, then extinguish itself as though someone had simply decided it was time for bed. Nobody remembered who had lived there last, and the few who claimed to recall anything spoke only of a woman with silver hair who collected clocks that never showed the same time twice. The neighbors had long since stopped calling the police about the light, stopped wondering who paid the electric bill, stopped asking questions that had no comfortable answers. Thomas Merriweather first noticed the light on a Tuesday in October, when insomnia drove him to his own window at an ungodly hour. He stood there in his boxers and undershirt, breath fogging the cold glass, watching that distant yellow glow with the peculiar fascination of a man who has nothing better to occupy his sleepless hours. The light seemed warmer than it should be, more inviting than any abandoned house had a right to offer. He found himself wondering what room it illuminated, what furniture still gathered dust in that forgotten space, what shadows might dance along walls that hadn't known human voices in nearly 2 decades. The next night, he was at his window again at 3:47 a.m. precisely, coffee growing cold in his hand, waiting. The light appeared exactly on schedule, punctual as a heartbeat, and Thomas felt something shift in his chest, a mixture of vindication and unease that comes from discovering a mystery behaves according to rules, even if you don't understand them. He watched the full 11 minutes, counting them off in his head, and when the light finally died, he felt oddly bereft, as though he'd been abandoned mid-conversation by a particularly engaging companion. By Friday, Thomas had decided to approach the house. He told himself it was simple curiosity, the kind of rational investigation any reasonable person would undertake when confronted with an unexplained phenomenon in their neighborhood. He didn't examine too closely why he'd begun setting an alarm for 3:30 a.m., why he'd started keeping a notebook beside his bed, why he'd sketched the house from memory during his lunch break at work, shading in that upstairs window with particular care. The drawing showed a Victorian with peeling paint the color of old teeth, a wraparound porch that sagged like a tired mouth, windows that reflected nothing but sky even when you stood directly in front of them. The gate opened with a sound like a question being asked in a voice too low to understand. Thomas hesitated there in the pre-dawn darkness, one hand on the wrought iron that was colder than the October air could account for, the other holding a flashlight he suddenly doubted would be necessary. The walkway stretched before him, cracked concrete populated by weeds that seemed to grow in patterns almost deliberate, almost linguistic, as though the neglect itself was trying to communicate something. He took a step forward, then another, and with each footfall, the ambient sounds of the sleeping neighborhood seemed to withdraw, like guests politely excusing themselves from a conversation that had taken an uncomfortable turn. The porch stairs creaked in 3 distinct tones: low, middle, high, a musical phrase that might have been welcoming or might have been a warning, depending on how you chose to interpret it. The front door was locked, but through the grimy window beside it, Thomas could see an entryway filled with shadows that moved with no discernible source, shifting and settling like a flock of birds readjusting themselves on a wire. He tried the door handle anyway, more out of completeness than expectation, and felt it turn smoothly beneath his palm. The door opened inward with a sigh that could have been wind through a gap in the frame, or could have been something else entirely, something that had been holding its breath for a very long time. Inside, the air tasted of dust and something sweeter, something that reminded Thomas of the museum his grandmother had taken him to as a child, where they'd walked through rooms full of furniture roped off from touching, belonging to people whose names were plaques on walls and nothing more. The entryway led to a staircase that rose into darkness, and beside it, a hallway extended toward what must be the back of the house, lined with doors that were all closed except one, which stood open just wide enough to suggest invitation without quite insisting on it. Thomas chose the stairs, following the logic that the light had appeared on the second floor, that answers lived upward rather than deeper in. The stairs numbered 13, a detail he counted twice to be certain, and the landing at the top opened onto a hallway with 4 doors, 3 closed and 1 slightly ajar, light seeping through the crack in a thin golden line that looked almost liquid in the darkness. Thomas approached that door with steps that seemed to take longer than they should, as though the hallway was stretching to accommodate his hesitation, giving him more time to reconsider, to turn back, to pretend he'd never seen that distant light from his bedroom window. But he didn't turn back. He never seriously considered it. Something had been set in motion the moment he'd started watching, the moment he'd begun to care about the mystery. And momentum was a force that cared nothing for second thoughts. He pushed the door open fully, and the hinges made no sound at all, which was somehow worse than if they'd screamed. The room beyond was a study, or had been once, lined with bookshelves that still held volumes so old their spines had faded to illegibility. A desk sat beneath the window with the light, which was currently off, but somehow still seemed to emanate a sense of recent occupation, as though warmth lingered in the air molecules, as though someone had been sitting there just moments before, reading by lamplight, and had stepped away only when they heard footsteps on the stairs. On the desk lay a leather-bound journal, open to a page covered in handwriting so precise it looked like typeset text. Each letter formed with the care of someone who believed words were sacred, were binding, were capable of altering the fabric of reality if you arranged them just so. Thomas found himself reading before he'd consciously decided to look at the page. The entry was dated September 14th, but the year was smudged, rendered illegible by what might have been water damage or might have been a deliberate obscuring. A willful severing of the text from linear time. The words described an experiment, though that wasn't quite the right term, a ritual, perhaps, or a procedure. Something that existed in the liminal space between science and superstition. The writer had been attempting to create a beacon, a signal that would persist beyond the boundaries of their own life, a lighthouse of consciousness that would continue to burn long after the lighthouse keeper had abandoned their post or been dragged into the dark waters they'd spent so long watching. 3:47 a.m. was specified as the optimal time, the moment when the veil was thinnest, when reality's attention was elsewhere, distracted by the turning of one day into another, by the administrative work of mortality and renewal. 11 minutes was the duration a human consciousness could sustain itself outside its physical housing before the effort became catastrophic, before the beacon began to consume the signal it was meant to transmit. The writer had been methodical in their preparation, had spent years learning to extend their awareness beyond their body, had practiced until they could exist as pure attention, pure intention, pure longing to be remembered, to matter, to continue in some form after the meat and bone had given up their ghost. Thomas turned the page, and the handwriting changed subtly, became less controlled, more urgent, the words crowding together as though racing to fit themselves onto paper before the hand that wrote them lost the strength to continue. The later entries spoke of success, of managing to separate consciousness from flesh for the full 11 minutes, of experiencing the house not as a collection of walls and floors, but as a unified organism, a thing with its own slow thoughts and patient hunger. The writer described seeing themselves from above, a small figure hunched at the desk, body breathing on autonomy, while the mind wandered the rooms like a ghost, practicing for the genuine article. They described the intoxication of it, the addictive quality of existence without physical limitation, the terrible freedom of consciousness unmoored from consequence. The final entry was dated October 31st, year still obscured, and it consisted of only 3 sentences. Tonight, I will attempt to sustain the beacon for longer than 11 minutes. I believe I can make it permanent, can transform myself into a signal that will never fade, a light that will burn long after every other light in this world has guttered and gone dark. If you are reading this, I have either succeeded beyond my wildest hopes or failed in ways I cannot currently imagine. Thomas looked up from the journal, and the lamp on the desk flickered on, casting the room in that same warm yellow glow he'd watched from his window for the past week. He hadn't touched anything, hadn't moved, had barely breathed, and yet the light responded to his presence as surely as if he'd flicked a switch. In the illumination, He could see details he'd missed in the darkness, photographs on the walls showing the same woman in different decades, aging backward as you moved from left to right, growing younger with each frame, until the final photo showed a child of perhaps 8 or 9, standing in front of this very house when it had been new, when its paint had been fresh, and its porch had stood straight and proud. The woman's face was familiar in a way Thomas couldn't quite place, a resemblance that nagged at the edges of his memory like a name on the tip of his tongue. He studied the photographs more closely, moving along the wall, watching her age in reverse, and with each image, the nagging feeling grew stronger, more insistent, until finally, with a sensation like ice water in his veins, he recognized the shape of her eyes, the set of her jaw, the particular way she held her head slightly tilted when facing a camera. He'd seen that face before, seen it in the mirror every morning of his life, seen it staring back at him from his own childhood photographs, from his mother's albums, from his grandmother's mantle. The woman in the photographs was family, some distant aunt or great-grandmother his mother had never bothered to mention, some branch of the family tree that had been pruned from conversation, excised from the comfortable narrative of their lineage. Thomas felt the weight of genetic recognition settle over him like a blanket, heavy and warm and suffocating all at once. He was connected to this place, to this woman, to this experiment in consciousness and persistence, by bonds thicker than curiosity, older than his own memory. The light remained steady for exactly 11 minutes, and Thomas stood there the entire time, unable to move, unwilling to break whatever spell had been cast. When the lamp finally extinguished itself, plunging the room back into pre-dawn darkness, he felt the absence like a physical thing, like a hand had been resting on his shoulder and had suddenly been withdrawn. He stumbled from the room, down the stairs, out the front door, across the yard, and back to his own house, moving on instinct and momentum, his conscious mind too busy processing what he'd learned to bother with the practicalities of navigation. In his bedroom, standing at his window, he watched the house at the end of Mercer Lane and understood that he would be back tomorrow night, and the night after, and all the nights that followed. The beacon had been calling him long before he'd consciously noticed it, pulling at something in his blood, in his genetic memory, drawing him home to a place he'd never been, but had always, in some sense, belonged to. He was part of the experiment now, part of the signal, and the only question remaining was whether he would remain an observer or eventually become something more, something that existed in that space between memory and presence, between the living and the light. Sleep did not come easily after that, and when it finally dragged him down, his dreams were populated by rooms he'd never walked through and faces he'd never met, but somehow knew by name, by reputation, by the weight of shared ancestry. He dreamed of standing at the desk in that upstairs room, pen in hand, writing in the journal, adding his own entry to the chronicle of consciousness and persistence, describing what it felt like to be both himself and the woman who had come before, both the beacon and the ship drawn toward it, both the question and the answer that only raised more questions in turn. When his alarm woke him the next evening at 3:30 a.m., Thomas rose without hesitation, dressed without thought, and walked through the sleeping neighborhood toward the house that waited for him with patient hunger, with familial recognition, with a light that would burn for exactly 11 minutes before releasing him to stumble home and pretend for another day that he had any choice in the matter at all. The pattern repeated for weeks, then months, and with each visitation, Thomas felt himself changing in ways both subtle and profound, his sense of self becoming more porous, more willing to accommodate the presence of something other, something that had been waiting in that house for nearly 2 decades, waiting for someone with the right blood, the right resonance, the right desperate hunger to matter, to persist, to transform loneliness into a signal that might, if sustained long enough, become indistinguishable from immortality. But we're getting ahead of ourselves, drawn forward by momentum into revelations best saved for later, for the deep hours when consciousness grows thin and suggestible, when the boundary between the story and the listener begins to blur in ways that might be uncomfortable if we thought about them too directly. Let us step back. Let us begin again. Let us approach the mystery from a different angle, from a different door, from a different life that will nonetheless lead us to the same essential truths, the same terrible freedoms, the same questions about what it means to be present, to be remembered, to leave a mark deeper than footprints in dust. Consider, if you will, the case of Sarah Kellerman, who worked the night shift at Mercy General Hospital, and who, on a Tuesday in November, encountered a patient who should not have been possible. The patient arrived without ambulance or announcement, simply appearing in bed 7 of the emergency ward at approximately 4:15 a.m., discovered by Sarah during her rounds. The patient was a woman, perhaps 60 years old, perhaps much older, with silver hair and eyes that reflected light at odd angles, like a cat's eyes, or a mirror, or something that existed between those two categories. The woman's chart listed her name as a leaner, no last name, and her reason for admission as temporal displacement, which was not a diagnosis Sarah recognized from any medical textbook she'd ever studied, not a condition covered in any training manual or whispered about in any nursing station gossip. Yet there the words sat, written in handwriting that matched none of the doctors on duty, in ink that seemed darker than the standard hospital-issue pens, in letters that looked almost like they'd been carved into the paper rather than written upon it. Sarah approached bed 7 with the professional calm of someone who'd seen enough strange things during night shifts to know that strangeness was relative, was contextual, was often less dangerous than the ordinary human suffering that filled the other beds. She checked Aliner's vitals, which were all normal, pulse steady, blood pressure unremarkable, oxygen saturation perfect. And yet, there was something fundamentally wrong with the numbers. Some quality Sarah couldn't articulate, but felt in her bones, in her training, in the part of her that had learned to recognize when a patient was dying, no matter what the machines claimed to the contrary. Aliner's eyes tracked Sarah's movements with an intensity that suggested the woman was not merely watching, but cataloging, recording, storing every gesture and expression for some purpose Sarah couldn't begin to guess. When Sarah finally met those eyes directly, Aliner smiled, and the smile was warm and terrible, and knowing in a way that made Sarah want to flee the room, flee the hospital, flee the entire concept of night shifts and mysterious patients and temporal displacement, whatever that meant. "You're wondering if I'm real," Aliner said, her voice carrying the texture of something rarely used, words spoken after long silence, like a music box wound after years in an attic. That's the right question, though perhaps not phrased as precisely as it could be. The better question would be, in what sense am I real? And does that sense matter to you? And will knowing the answer improve your life or complicate it beyond your capacity to cope? Sarah found her own voice after a moment's searching, found it hiding behind her professional training, behind her script of appropriate responses to patient statements. No matter how bizarre, I'm not wondering anything except what you need and how I can help you feel more comfortable. That's my job. That's all that matters right now. "Liar," Aliner said, but gently, affectionately almost, the way you might correct a child who's told a transparent falsehood about whether they've brushed their teeth. "You're wondering a great many things, and comfort is the least of them. You're wondering how I got here, who wrote my chart, what temporal displacement means, and whether you're currently dreaming this entire interaction, whether you'll wake up at home in your own bed and laugh about the strange places your subconscious takes you when you're overtired." This was true, but Sarah wasn't about to admit it. Instead, she busied herself adjusting Aliner's blankets, checking the IV that wasn't actually connected to anything, straightening items on the bedside table, in an effort to impose order on a situation that felt like it was actively resisting order, like it existed specifically to undermine every assumption Sarah had made about how hospitals worked, how reality worked, how conversations between nurses and patients were supposed to proceed. "I've been watching you," Aliner continued, and now her voice carried harmonics, undertones, suggestions of other voices speaking in unison, or in echo, or in some relationship to time that made the words seem to arrive from multiple directions at once. "Not you specifically, not Sarah Kellerman, who lives in apartment 3B and drinks too much coffee and hasn't called her mother in 6 weeks. I've been watching the pattern you represent, the archetype, the people who work in the dark hours, who bear witness to transition, who stand at the threshold between life and whatever comes after. and pretend they're simply administering medication, simply checking vitals, simply doing a job that doesn't fundamentally alter them with every shift. Sarah's hand stilled on the blanket, and she realized she was gripping the fabric hard enough to whiten her knuckles, hard enough to hurt. I don't know what you're talking about. I'm going to get the doctor now. Doctor, Reeves should see you, should explain your treatment plan, should tell you that there is no treatment plan for being unstuck from the moment of your death, for existing in a state of perpetual transition, for having become the very thing you spent your life trying to prevent. Eleanor's smile widened, and in the fluorescent light of the emergency ward, her teeth looked too white, too perfect, too much like they'd been carved from porcelain rather than grown from living tissue. I was a doctor once, you know, not here, not at Mercy General, but at a hospital very much like it, in a city very much like this one, in a time that is both 50 years ago and also right now, depending on how you choose to measure such things. Sarah did leave then, walking quickly, but not quite running, maintaining her professional composure through sheer force of will and muscle memory. She found Dr. Reeves in the staff room, hunched over a tablet, squinting at lab results in the way of someone who's been staring at screens too long and knows they should schedule an eye exam, but keeps putting it off. He looked up when Sarah entered, and his expression shifted from tired to concerned when he saw whatever was showing on her face. Bed 7, Sarah said, and was annoyed to hear her voice shaking slightly, betraying her in ways she'd trained it not to. The patient, Eleanor. When did she come in? Who admitted her? I can't find any intake paperwork, any insurance information, any emergency contact. Her chart just says temporal displacement, which isn't a thing, isn't possible, isn't. Dr. Reeves was already standing, already moving toward the door, already shifting into the mode of a doctor, confronting a mystery, which was different from the mode of a doctor treating a known condition, sharper somehow, more engaged, more alive to possibility. They walked back to bed 7 together, Sarah slightly behind, grateful to have someone else take point, someone with more authority, more letters after their name, more right to demand explanations from patients who spoke in riddles and smiled with porcelain teeth. Bed 7 was empty. The blankets were smooth, the pillow pristine, the machines all silent and dark. There was no sign that anyone had been there, no depression in the mattress, no warmth lingering in the air, no chart hanging from the foot of the bed. Dr. Reeves checked the neighboring beds, asked the patients if they'd seen anyone in bed 7, received only confused, negative responses from people who had their own problems to worry about, their own pain to manage, their own reasons for being. She slept poorly that day, dreams fragmented and strange, populated by patients whose faces she couldn't quite remember, but whose suffering she could recall in perfect detail, by hallways that extended forever in both directions, by doors that opened onto other doors, that opened onto rooms where impossible things conducted experiments in consciousness and persistence, in light and longing, in the terrible desire to be remembered after everything else has been forgotten. When her alarm went off at 10 p.m., earlier than necessary for her next shift, but exactly the right time to allow for a detour, Sarah rose with the certainty of someone who'd already made a decision hours ago, who'd perhaps made the decision the moment Alina had smiled at her with those porcelain teeth, who'd perhaps been moving toward this moment for years without knowing it. Every night shift, another step down a path that led inevitably to 1247 Mercer Lane, to 3:47 a.m., to answers that would only breed more questions, deeper questions, questions that would follow her for the rest of her life, like shadows cast by a light she couldn't quite see. The house at 1247 Mercer Lane was the same house Thomas Merriweather had been visiting, though neither of them knew about the other yet, though both were responding to the same signal, the same beacon, the same call that went out every night at exactly 3:47 a.m., searching for those who could hear it, who would respond to it, who carried the right frequency in their blood, or their history, or their desperate hunger to understand what it meant to persist beyond the boundaries of flesh and time. Sarah arrived at 3:40 a.m., parking down the street, approaching on foot through pre-dawn darkness that seemed thicker than it should be, more textured, as though the air itself had grown dense with possibility, with potential, with the weight of choices about to be made. The house looked abandoned, looked hostile to human habitation, and yet that upstairs window glowed with warm yellow light, inviting and terrible in equal measure, promising answers and threatening transformations, offering everything Sarah wanted, and everything she should know better than to accept. She was climbing the porch stairs when she noticed the man standing in the yard, half hidden by the shadow of an overgrown bush, watching the house with an expression that Sarah recognized, because she'd seen it in the mirror earlier that evening. Fear and fascination braided together, terror and longing holding hands, the look of someone who knows they're about to do something monumentally stupid, but can't quite bring themselves to care, can't quite summon the self-preservation instinct that would save them from themselves. "You got a card too," the man said, and it wasn't a question. He stepped out of the shadows, and Sarah saw he was probably in his mid-30s, dressed in the careful casual style of someone who works from home and sometimes forgets what day it is, what month even, time measured not by calendar, but by deadlines and video calls, and the slow accumulation of coffee cups on a desk that used to be clean, used to be organized, used to reflect a life with boundaries and structure. "Thomas," he added, extending a hand that trembled slightly in the dim light from distant street lamps. "Thomas Merriweather. I live 2 streets over. I've been coming here for 3 months now, every night, watching the light, trying to understand what it wants, what it's offering, what price it's asking in exchange for answers to questions I didn't even know I had until I started asking them. Sarah shook his hand, found it cold and damp with nervous sweat, found herself oddly grateful for the company, for evidence that she wasn't alone in this particular brand of madness, that the call had gone out to others, that whatever was happening here was big enough to require multiple witnesses, multiple participants, multiple people willing to stand at the threshold and peek into whatever darkness waited on the other side. Sarah Kellerman, she replied. I'm a nurse at Mercy General. I met a patient tonight who shouldn't have existed, who gave me the address, who said the threshold recognizes its own, whatever that means. I've been working night shifts for 7 years, and I thought I'd seen everything, thought nothing could surprise me anymore, thought I understood the boundaries of what's possible in the dark hours between sunset and sunrise. You were wrong, Thomas said, and smiled. And the smile was both sad and excited, the expression of someone who's discovered that the world is stranger and more terrible than they'd imagined, than they'd been taught to believe, than their education and experience had prepared them to handle. We were all wrong. Come on. The light will be on for exactly 11 minutes, and we have maybe 30 seconds before it starts. If we're going to do this, if we're going to walk through that door and climb those stairs and stand in that room where consciousness learns to exist outside the meat that houses it, we need to go now, together, because I don't think I can do it alone anymore. Don't think I can keep coming back night after night, getting closer and closer to accepting what's being offered, to becoming part of the signal, instead of just someone who watches it from a safe distance. They went inside together, Sarah and Thomas, two strangers united by curiosity and something deeper, something that lived in blood and genetics, and the human hunger to matter, to persist, to rage against the dying of the light, by becoming light itself, by transforming suffering and loneliness into a beacon that would burn long after their bodies had become food for worms, long after their names had been forgotten by everyone who'd ever known them. The upstairs room was exactly as Thomas had described it during their hurried climb up the stairs, exactly as Sarah had somehow known it would be. The desk, the journal, the photographs aging backward along the wall, the lamp that burned with that warm yellow glow, with that invitation, with that promise of understanding, if only you were willing to pay the price, to take the risk, to step across the threshold, and accept that some questions can only be answered by becoming the answer yourself. They read the journal together, heads bent close over the pages, breathing in synchronization without meaning to, their presence somehow amplifying the effect, making the words seem more urgent, more immediate, more like instructions than like historical record. The experiment was described in detail, the meditation techniques, the breathing patterns, the specific configuration of consciousness that allowed the writer to separate awareness from flesh, to exist as pure attention for those crucial 11 minutes, to become the beacon that still called out decades after the body that had housed it had fallen silent, had been buried or burned, or disposed of according to whatever protocols governed such things. "We could try it," Thomas whispered, and his voice carried the texture of someone who'd been thinking about this for a long time, who'd been building up to this moment through months of solitary visitation, who'd been waiting for permission, for company, for someone else to validate the terrible desire that had been growing in him like a second self, like a parasite or a partner, or perhaps some combination of both. Sarah should have said no, should have been the voice of reason, should have remembered her training, her ethics, her responsibility to remain grounded in the reality that paid her mortgage and filled her refrigerator and provided structure to her days. But she didn't say no. She said how, and Thomas explained what he'd learned from months of reading the journal, from studying the photographs, from sitting in this room night after night, feeling the presence of something that wanted to teach him, wanted to guide him, wanted to welcome him into a state of being that transcended the limitations of flesh and time and the terrible isolation of individual consciousness. The technique was complex, but not impossible. Meditation elevated to ritual, attention focused to the point of transformation. Breath and heartbeat synchronized into a pattern that opened doors usually kept locked, usually kept safe behind the meat and bone that protected the vulnerable spark of awareness from the vast, indifferent darkness that surrounded it on all sides. They tried together, sitting on the floor of that upstairs room, backs against the wall, hands clasped between them in a gesture that was part support and part circuit, part human connection and part magical working, part desperate bid for meaning and part surrender to forces they couldn't name but could feel, could sense gathering in the corners of the room, in the spaces between their synchronized breaths, in the moment that stretched and thinned as they pushed their awareness out, out, out beyond the comfortable prison of their skulls, for a moment, for an eternity, for exactly 11 minutes measured by the lamp's glow. Sarah and Thomas existed as something other than themselves, as pure attention distributed through the house like light through water, observing without eyes, understanding without words, experiencing the memories embedded in walls and floors and furniture, the accumulated weight of all the lives that had touched this space, all the consciousness that had flowed through these rooms like electricity through wires, leaving traces, leaving marks, leaving something of themselves behind to mingle with the beacon that Alina had become, that the silver-haired woman in the photographs had transformed herself into through willpower and technique and desperate loneliness. They saw Alina's life, not all of it, but glimpses, fragments, moments of particular intensity that had burned themselves into the fabric of the house, into the substrate of reality itself. They saw her as a child standing in front of the newly built house, proud and small and full of certainty that her life would matter, that she would matter. They saw her as a young doctor, brilliant and ambitious, frustrated by the limitations of medicine, by how little they could actually do for patients beyond managing symptoms, beyond making people comfortable while their bodies betrayed them in ways both predictable and cruel. They saw her discovering the techniques, the meditation practices that certain rare traditions had preserved, that certain desperate seekers had developed independently, that allowed consciousness to exist independently of the meat that generated it, if only briefly, if only with tremendous effort and risk. They saw her making the decision to become the beacon, to attempt permanent separation, to transform herself into a signal that would call out across decades, across the boundary between life and whatever came after, searching for others who could hear it, who would respond, who would join their awareness to hers and create something larger, something more persistent, something that might, if enough consciousness joined the signal, become genuinely immortal, become a form of life that existed in pure information, in attention and intention, and the fundamental human refusal to simply end, to simply stop, to simply accept that consciousness was merely an emergent property of electrical activity in meat, and would naturally cease when the meat failed. They saw the moment of her transformation, saw her sitting at that desk, lamp burning bright, consciousness pushing out, out beyond the 11-minute limit, beyond the point of safety, beyond the point where the thread connecting awareness to flesh could snap back like an overstretched rubber band. They saw her succeed, saw her awareness anchor itself to the house, to the specific configuration of space and time that existed in this location at exactly 3:47 a.m. Saw her become the beacon she'd intended, saw her triumph and her terror as she realized what she'd done, what she'd become, what she'd traded in exchange for persistence. And then the 11 minutes ended, and Sarah and Thomas snapped back into their bodies with the violence of bungee jumpers reaching the end of their cords. Consciousness slamming into flesh with force that left them gasping, trembling, clutching each other not with romance, but with the desperate grip of drowning people who have just been pulled from deep water, who can't quite believe they're breathing air again, who can't quite process the transition from that vast distributed awareness back into the tight confines of individual existence. Did you? Thomas started, but couldn't finish, because there were no words for what they'd experienced, no vocabulary in common language to describe what it felt like to be multiple and singular simultaneously, to experience memory that wasn't yours, but also wasn't not yours, to understand that consciousness was both more fragile and more persistent than anyone who hadn't done what they'd just done could possibly comprehend. Yes, Sarah said, and that single syllable carried enough weight to buckle the floor, enough meaning to fill volumes, enough certainty to anchor both of them to the reality they'd briefly transcended and must now return to, must now pretend was sufficient, was enough, was all there was when they knew now that it wasn't, that it couldn't be, that they'd been living in a smaller reality than actually existed, and now had to decide whether that knowledge was a gift or a curse. The lamp went out on schedule, and they sat in darkness, still holding hands, still breathing in rhythm, still connected in ways that went deeper than physical touch, deeper than shared experience, deeper than anything Sarah had felt in 7 years of holding the hands of dying patients, of bearing witness to the threshold they just crossed voluntarily, experimentally, with the option to return that those patients hadn't been given. They left the house as dawn was beginning to pale the eastern sky, left it in silence, walking together down the porch stairs, across the yard, through the gate that closed behind them with a sound like a sigh of satisfaction, like a door being shut on a successful transaction. At the sidewalk, they paused, looked at each other in the growing light, and saw themselves reflected in the other's eyes, changed, marked, initiated into something that had no name, but felt ancient, felt purposeful, felt like the beginning of something that would define the rest of their lives, however long those lives might last. Tomorrow night, Thomas asked, and it wasn't really a question, because they both knew the answer, both felt the pull of the beacon calling them back, both understood that they'd crossed a threshold from which there was no return, not really, not in any way that mattered. They tasted existence outside the meat, and flesh would never be quite enough again, would never feel like home in the way it once had, would always feel slightly constraining, slightly inadequate, slightly temporary, in a way that consciousness, they now knew, did not have to be. Tomorrow night, Sarah agreed, and they parted, walking to their separate cars, driving to their separate homes, each carrying the memory of being something other than themselves, something larger, something that existed in the space between question and answer, between life and light, between the desperate human desire to matter and the terrible price that mattering sometimes required. But the story doesn't end there, because stories about consciousness and persistence never really end. They just pause, take breath, gather strength for the next phase. Sarah went to work that night as scheduled, moved through her shift in a haze of normalcy that felt like costume, like method acting, like she was playing the role of Sarah Kellerman, the nurse, when actually she was something else now, something that wore Sarah's body and spoke with Sarah's voice, but had expanded beyond the boundaries that used to define her so completely. The patients didn't notice anything different, or if they did, they attributed it to the usual exhaustion of night shift workers, to the 1,000-yard stare that develops after too many consecutive nights of bearing witness to suffering and mortality. But Dr. Reeves noticed, caught her in the hall around 2 a.m., pulled her aside with the gentle concern of someone who genuinely cared about his staff, who understood that the work they did exacted a toll that went beyond physical fatigue, that touched something deeper, something in the soul or psyche, or whatever you wanted to call the part of you that could be wounded by witnessing too much pain, too much loss, too much evidence that the universe was fundamentally indifferent to human suffering. "Sarah," he said, and his voice carried the weight of someone about to say something important, something uncomfortable, something that needed to be said, even though saying it would change the relationship between speaker and listener in ways that couldn't be undone. "I'm worried about you. The incident with the non-existent patient yesterday, the way you've been moving through your shifts lately like you're somewhere else, like you're not fully present. I think maybe you need to take some time off, maybe talk to someone, maybe consider whether night shifts are still the right fit for where you are in your life." Sarah looked at him, really looked at him, and for a moment she considered telling him everything about Aliner, about the house on Mercer Lane, about what she'd experienced in that upstairs room, about the beacon and the signal, and the discovery that consciousness was both more fragile and more persistent than medical school had taught them. But she saw in his eyes that he couldn't understand, that the explanation would only confirm his concerns, would only cement her transition from competent professional to someone who needed intervention, needed help, needed to be protected from herself and the dangerous ideas she'd been entertaining. So instead she smiled, thanked him for his concern, agreed to schedule some vacation days, promised to take care of herself, and gave him all the verbal and nonverbal cues that indicated she was receiving his feedback appropriately, processing it constructively, taking steps to address the issues he'd identified with the grace and maturity of someone who recognized they'd been pushing too hard, working too much, neglecting the self-care that prevented burnout and breakdown. He believed her, or pretended to, or chose to accept her performance because it was easier than pushing further, than escalating his concern into formal action, than admitting that sometimes people who seemed fine were actually experiencing profound transformations that had nothing to do with stress or fatigue, and everything to do with encountering truths too large to fit comfortably inside the frameworks that organized their professional and personal lives. Sarah finished her shift, drove home through dawn light that seemed different now, richer somehow, more textured, as though she was seeing additional colors that existed just outside the normal human visual range, as though the experience in Aliner's house had changed not just her consciousness, but her very perception, her ability to process sensory input, her relationship with the physical world that suddenly seemed less solid than she'd always assumed, less permanent, less authoritative in its insistence that this was all there was, that matter was primary and consciousness merely its byproduct, its epiphenomenon, its accidental passenger on a journey matter was taking with or without awareness along for the ride. She slept deeply that day, deeper than she had in months, and her dreams were different now, more vivid, more coherent, more like experiences she was having than stories her subconscious was telling her. She dreamed she was standing in a vast space that might have been the house on Mercer Lane, or might have been her own consciousness, or might have been some configuration of reality that existed between those two extremes. Alina was there, and so were others, dozens of them, hundreds perhaps, figures made of light and attention, consciousnesses that had found their way to the beacon, that had learned the techniques, that had chosen persistence over cessation, continuity over ending, transformation over the simple biological death that awaited everyone who didn't take the risks, who didn't learn the methods, they went inside together, climbed the stairs together, entered the room together. And this time they were ready, were prepared, had thought about the technique, had studied the journal's instructions, had made their decision without quite admitting it to themselves, without quite saying aloud what they both knew they were going to do when the 11 minutes ended, when the moment came to either snap back into flesh or let the cord break, let themselves become signal instead of receiver, beacon instead of ship, light instead of the things light merely illuminates. The lamp flickered on at exactly 3:47 a.m., and they began the meditation, the breathing, the focusing of attention that would allow them to separate consciousness from flesh, to exist as pure awareness in the space between, in the configuration of reality that Alina and her collective had been building, had been reinforcing, had been expanding to accommodate more consciousnesses, more perspectives, more experiences that would enrich the whole, that would add to the collective without erasing the individual, that would create something genuinely new in the universe, awareness that persisted without flesh, that existed in information rather than meat, that could endure as long as there were spaces where attention had worn reality thin, where the veil could be pierced, where the beacon could burn and call out to others who were ready, who were willing, who were desperate enough to take the risk. Sarah felt herself rising, expanding, distributing through the house, through the room, through the spaces between spaces where Alina and the others existed, where consciousness had learned to persist without the limitations that usually defined it, where she could be multiple and singular simultaneously, could experience memory that stretched back through Alina to the doctors and patients and caregivers who'd come before, who'd all touched this place, this configuration, this beacon that had been burning for decades, calling out, gathering strength, building towards something that none of them could quite name, but all of them could feel approaching, could sense gathering like a storm on a horizon that existed in time rather than space. She was aware of Thomas beside her, or not beside her exactly, because spatial relationships meant something different here, but present, connected, joined in the effort, in the transformation, in the choice they were both making without words, without discussion, with only the certainty that came from having tasted this state before, having understood what they were giving up and what they were gaining, having decided that persistence mattered more than comfort, that consciousness was worth preserving even at the cost of everything else, even at the price of never sleeping again, never eating again, never touching another human being except in the strange, distributed way they touched each other now. Awareness brushing against awareness, experience mingling with experience, memory becoming shared property, identity becoming porous and strange and wonderful. The 11 minutes approached their end, and Sarah felt the pull of her body, felt the cord that connected her awareness to her flesh, felt the biological imperative that insisted she return, that warned her that going further was death, was suicide, was the end of everything she'd been and everything she might become. But she also felt Aliner's presence, and Thomas's, and the hundreds of others who'd made this choice before her, who'd crossed this threshold and persisted, who existed now as proof that consciousness could endure, that awareness didn't need flesh to continue, that the universe was stranger and more generous than biology suggested, than evolution had prepared them to understand. She let the cord snap. She felt it break, felt the connection to her flesh sever like a cut cable, like an anchor rope released, like the last tether holding a balloon to the ground being cut, and the balloon rising, rising, rising into a sky that had no ceiling, that extended forever in directions that had no names in the vocabularies of the living. She felt herself becoming signal rather than receiver, felt herself joining the beacon that Aliner had built, that the collective had been tending and expanding and strengthening for years, for decades, for however long it had been burning, calling out, gathering those who could hear it, who would respond, who would choose this particular form of persistence over the alternatives that biology and culture had taught them to accept as inevitable. Thomas came with her, or she went with him, or they went together into that space between, into that configuration of consciousness that Aliner and her collective had created, had been building, had been preparing for exactly this purpose, to preserve awareness, to extend consciousness beyond the natural limits, to create a new form of life that existed in information rather than matter, that could persist as long as there were spaces where attention had worn reality thin, where humans had gathered and focused their awareness with enough intensity to leave a mark that consciousness could inhabit, could use as a substrate, could transform into a home that was strange and terrible and wonderful all at once. And in the emergency ward at Mercy General Hospital, in an apartment 2 streets over from Mercer Lane, 2 bodies stopped breathing, stopped generating warmth, stopped maintaining the electrical activity that medical instruments recognized as life. The bodies would be found eventually, would be processed according to protocol, would be grieved by family and colleagues and friends who would never understand what had really happened, who would call it suicide or accident or stroke, or some combination of factors that made more sense than the truth, that fit more comfortably into frameworks that insisted consciousness was merely the product of biological activity, and naturally ceased when that activity stopped. But consciousness didn't cease. Sarah and Thomas persisted, joined the collective, became part of the beacon that burned every night at 3:47 a.m., that called out to others who could hear it, who would respond, who would make the same choice they'd made, who would trade the certainty of death for the uncertainty of persistence, who would join their awareness to the signal and make it stronger, make it more capable of reaching further, of gathering more consciousnesses, of building towards something that none of them could quite name, but all of them could feel approaching, could sense gathering like a storm on a horizon that existed in time rather than space. The beacon continued to burn, continued to call out, continued to gather those who could hear it. And every night at 3:47 a.m., in houses and hospitals and abandoned places where the veil was thin, consciousnesses that had learned the technique would separate from their flesh for exactly 11 minutes, would taste what Sarah and Thomas had chosen, would begin to understand what Alina had discovered, would prepare themselves for the moment when they too would have to decide, return to the comfort of flesh and the certainty of death, or join the collective, become part of the signal, persist in a form that was strange and terrible and wonderful. That was both a triumph over mortality and a surrender to something that might be immortality or might be something else entirely, something that had no name in human languages because humans had never successfully created it before, had never believed it was possible, had never been desperate enough and curious enough and hungry enough for meaning to take the risks, to learn the techniques, to stand at that threshold and step across it with eyes open, with full knowledge of what they were trading and what they might, if they were lucky or unlucky or simply different from everyone who'd come before, gain in exchange. Now let us shift our perspective. Let us approach the mystery from another angle, through another door, through the eyes of someone who didn't choose the beacon, who didn't hear the call, who nevertheless found themselves touched by the edges of this strange transformation, affected by the ripples it sent through reality, through the fabric of a world that had always been stranger than the living realized, than evolution had prepared them to perceive, than education and culture had taught them to acknowledge. Detective Marcus Holloway was investigating what the department classified as a cluster: suicide, 4 people in 3 months, all between the ages of 30 and 45, all with no prior history of mental health issues, all found dead in their beds or chairs or sometimes standing, bodies rigid, faces displaying expressions that the first responders described as peaceful, as ecstatic even, as though they'd died in the middle of experiencing something wonderful rather than the trauma and fear that usually accompanied death, especially self-inflicted death, especially death that came from choosing cessation over the continuation, that every biological imperative insisted was the only sane option. The bodies showed no signs of trauma, no evidence of poison or drug use. No indication that anything external had caused their deaths. The autopsies had been frustratingly inconclusive. Hearts that had simply stopped, brains that had simply ceased electrical activity, as though these people had just decided to turn off, to power down, to stop being alive without bothering with the usual intermediate steps of disease or injury or age that gave death a cause, gave it a shape that fit into the forms Marcus had to fill out, that made sense in the framework of investigation and evidence and rational explanation. But there were patterns, and Marcus had built his career on recognizing patterns, on finding the threads that connected seemingly random events, on understanding that coincidence was rare and therefore suspect, that when multiple unusual things happened in close proximity, there was almost always a reason, a connection, a story that explained how the pieces fit together, if only you were patient enough and observant enough and willing enough to follow the evidence wherever it led, even when it led to places that didn't make sense, that challenged assumptions, that suggested the world operated according to rules different from the ones they taught him at the academy. The pattern was location. All 4 victims had lived within a 2-mile radius of Mercer Lane. All 4 had been found dead between the hours of 3:00 and 5:00 a.m., and all 4 had, in the weeks preceding their deaths, exhibited behavioral changes that friends and family described as subtle but notable: increased distraction, decreased sleep, growing fascination with topics related to consciousness, meditation, the nature of self, the boundary between life and death. One victim had started attending workshops on lucid dreaming. Another had been researching near-death experiences, had checked out books from the library about out-of-body experiences, about astral projection, about the various practices and philosophies that suggested consciousness could exist independently of the body, could travel, could persist beyond the dissolution of flesh. Marcus spread photos of the victims across his desk: Sarah Kellerman, Thomas Merriweather, David Chen, and Maria Rodriguez. 4 people who'd never met, who had no connections through work or social circles or family, who shared nothing obvious except their age range, their geographic proximity, and their inexplicable deaths. He stared at their faces, looking for additional patterns, for some quality that united them beyond the circumstances of their passing. And slowly, gradually, he began to see it, a look in their eyes, a particular cast to their expressions, something that suggested they'd all been thinking about the same thing, contemplating the same possibility, standing at the edge of the same decision, and choosing, ultimately, to jump. The breakthrough came from Sarah Kellerman's apartment, where a uniformed officer conducting a routine sweep of the premises had found a card tucked into a book on the nightstand, heavy paper stock, with an address printed in dark ink: 1247 Mercer Lane. The officer had noted it in his report, thinking it might be significant, might explain where Sarah had been going during the weeks before her death, might offer some clue to her state of mind, to what had driven a competent professional with no history of depression or suicidal ideation to simply stop living one night without warning, without note, without any of the usual preparations and announcements that accompanied voluntary death. Marcus drove to 1247 Mercer Lane at midday, when sunlight made everything look ordinary, made the house look like nothing more than an abandoned Victorian in need of renovation. A property that had fallen through the cracks of estate management and municipal oversight. A structure waiting patiently for someone to care enough to either restore it or tear it down and build something new in its place. There was no yellow crime scene tape, no indication that anything notable had ever happened here. No reason to think this house was anything other than what it appeared to be: old, empty, gradually surrendering to the entropy that claimed all structures left untended for too long. The front door was locked, but the lock was old, yielded easily to the basic techniques Marcus had learned early in his career, back when he was young enough to believe that every case had a solution, every mystery an explanation, every death a cause that could be identified and checked off on the appropriate form. He entered with his flashlight drawn, though the daylight streaming through dirty windows provided adequate illumination, made the dust motes visible in the air like snow falling in slow motion, made the interior look less haunted than tired, less sinister than sad. He searched the ground floor methodically, finding nothing but dust and the detritus of long abandonment, furniture too damaged to be worth removing, paper trash that crumbled at touch, evidence of raccoons or possums taking shelter in winter, using human spaces for purposes humans had never intended. The kitchen cabinets still held dishes, plates and cups covered in dust so thick they looked like archaeological artifacts rather than objects from living memory. The bathroom fixtures had rusted through, pipes showing through holes in the floor like bones exposed by erosion. The stairs to the second floor looked questionable, boards warped and water damaged, railings loose in their moorings. Marcus tested each step carefully, weight distributed to avoid crashes, to avoid the embarrassment of explaining to his sergeant why he'd injured himself investigating a connection that was tenuous at best, that probably meant nothing, that was likely just a coincidence, just an address one victim had written down for reasons that had nothing to do with her death, nothing to do with the other victims, nothing to do with the growing unease Marcus felt as he climbed higher, as he approached the second floor where 4 doors waited, 3 closed and 1 slightly ajar. He pushed that door open fully, and despite the daylight, despite his years of experience, despite every rational instinct insisting that empty rooms were just empty rooms, Marcus felt his breath catch, felt his heart accelerate, felt the fine hairs on his arms stand erect in response to something he couldn't name, could definitely feel, something that lingered in the air like ozone after lightning, like the pressure drop before a storm, like the presence of something that had been here recently and might return at any moment. The room was a study, lined with bookshelves, dominated by a desk positioned beneath the window. On that desk lay a leather-bound journal, open to a page covered in handwriting so precise it looked mechanical. Marcus approached carefully, stepping around the dust patterns on the floor that suggested other people had been here recently. Multiple visitors who'd stood in specific positions, who'd moved in particular patterns, who'd been doing something more than just exploring an abandoned house, something more purposeful, more ritualistic, more organized than simple trespassing or vandalism, or the usual activities that drew people to forgotten spaces. He photographed everything before touching anything, following procedure, even though this wasn't officially a crime scene, even though he had no warrant, even though any evidence he collected here might be inadmissible if this case ever went to trial, which it wouldn't because there was no crime to prosecute, no perpetrator to charge, just 4 dead people, and a growing collection of questions that didn't have comfortable answers. The journal detailed an experiment, a technique, a method for separating consciousness from flesh. Marcus read 3 pages before closing the book, before stepping back, before pulling out his phone to call for backup, to request that this location be officially processed, to get people here who were better at evidence collection than he was, who could catalog this properly, who could make sense of what the journal was describing, and whether it had anything to do with 4 people dying in their sleep, with expressions of peace and ecstasy on their faces. But before he could dial, before he could take that step that would bring the full weight of the department's attention to this house, to this room, to this journal, and whatever it contained, Marcus noticed the photographs on the walls. They showed a woman aging in reverse, growing younger from left to right. And in the final photograph, she stood in front of this house, this very house when it had been new, when its paint had been fresh, and its porch solid, and its windows clear. And beside her in that photograph, hand resting on her shoulder, stood a man Marcus recognized from his own family albums, from his grandmother's mantle, from the stories she'd told about her brother who'd died young, who'd been brilliant and strange, and fascinated by questions that made the rest of the family uncomfortable. Questions about consciousness and death, and what, if anything, persisted after the body failed, after the meat stopped processing electrical signals, after the thing that made a person, rather than just a collection of biological processes, finally gave up its ghost. Marcus's great uncle had lived in this house, had conducted experiments here, had perhaps died here, or perhaps transcended here, or perhaps achieved something that existed between those 2 categories, between ending and continuing, between cessation and the kind of persistence that the journal described, that the technique promised, that 4 people in 3 months had apparently believed in strongly enough to risk everything, to sacrifice the comfortable prison of flesh for the uncertain freedom of consciousness, unmoored, unsupported, sustained by nothing but will and technique and desperate belief in the possibility that humans could be more than biology suggested, more than evolution had prepared them to become. Marcus sat down on the floor, back against the wall, phone forgotten in his hand, mind racing through implications and connections, through the terrible logic of what he was beginning to understand. The deaths weren't suicides in any conventional sense. They were transformations, deliberate and informed, carried out by people who'd found this place, who'd learned the technique, who decided that persistence in this new form was worth the price of everything they'd been before. They'd become something else, something that existed somewhere else, in some configuration of reality that the journal kept referring to as the beacon, as the collective, as the space between spaces where consciousness learned to exist without flesh, where awareness persisted beyond the limits biology imposed. And if Marcus's great uncle had been involved in this, had perhaps been one of the first to achieve the transformation, then the beacon had been burning for longer than 3 months, longer than the 4 deaths Marcus was investigating, perhaps for decades, perhaps since the early experiments the journal described, since the initial successes that had led to refinement, to perfection, to the development of a technique reliable enough that ordinary people could learn it, could practice it, could use it to escape mortality, to trade the certainty of death for the uncertainty of persistence in a form that had no precedent, no category, no name in the languages of the living. Marcus should have called for backup then, should have reported what he'd found, should have followed procedure, and let others make the decisions about what this meant, about how to handle a situation that fell outside the normal categories of investigation and evidence and criminal justice. But he didn't call. Instead, he opened the journal again, began reading more carefully, began absorbing the techniques it described, the meditation patterns, the breathing exercises, the specific configuration of consciousness that allowed separation, that enabled the transformation, that opened the door to the beacon, to the collective, to whatever Aliner and his great uncle and all the others had become in their determination to persist, to matter, to refuse the finality of death. He read through the afternoon, through the fading light, through the transition from day to evening, to the deep darkness that preceded midnight. He lit no lamps, used only his flashlight when necessary. Marcus found himself moving without conscious decision, positioning himself at the desk where his great uncle must have sat decades ago, where Sarah Kellerman and Thomas Merriweather had sat just days before their bodies were found, where countless others had probably sat before making the choice, before taking the risk, before stepping across the threshold into whatever configuration of reality the beacon occupied. whatever space between spaces, where consciousness learned to persist without the support of meat and bone. He began the meditation, following the journal's instructions, focusing his breathing, narrowing his attention to a single point that existed simultaneously inside and outside his skull. That was both him and not him. That was the door consciousness could pass through if properly prepared, properly motivated, properly desperate to escape the limitations that biology imposed. That evolution had encoded, that culture reinforced through 1,000 daily reminders that the body was all there was, that flesh was destiny, that death was the end of everything rather than a threshold to something else, something stranger, something that his gray tuncle and a leaner, and all the others had discovered, had achieved, had become. Marcus felt himself rising, expanding, distributing through the room in a way that should have been impossible, but somehow wasn't. That felt natural despite having no precedent in his experience. That seemed like something he'd always been capable of, but had simply never attempted before, never believed in strongly enough to make it real. He was aware of the room not as a collection of objects, but as a space thick with memory, with accumulated attention, with the residue of all the consciousnesses that had passed through here, that had practiced here, that had used this space as a launching point into the configuration of reality, where the beacon burned, where the collective waited, where consciousness learned to exist without flesh. And then he felt them a leaner, and his great uncle, whose name had been Jonathan, and Sarah, and Thomas, and David, and Maria, and dozens of others, hundreds perhaps, consciousnesses arranged not in space, but in some other dimension that his ordinary awareness had never been equipped to perceive, that required this separated state to detect, to navigate, to understand. They were present without being physically present, were real without being material, were alive in some sense that redefined the word, that expanded it beyond biological processes into territory that had no precedent, no category, no name in the vocabularies that ordinary humans used to describe their experience of reality. Detective Holloway, Aliner's voice said, though voice wasn't quite the right word because there was no sound, no vibration of air, just meaning appearing directly in his awareness, as though his thoughts and her thoughts existed in the same space, as though consciousness was a shared medium that could carry communication more directly than language, more precisely than words, more honestly than speech, which always carried the risk of misunderstanding, of deception, of the space between intention and interpretation. Your great uncle Jonathan wanted us to reach out to you specifically. Aliner continued, and now Marcus could feel Jonathan's presence beside Aliner's, could recognize the particular configuration of attention that was uniquely his relation, his ancestor, his family, his blood. He's been watching the investigation, has been concerned that you'll misunderstand what's happened. We'll classify it as something to be prevented rather than something to be understood, to be studied, to be potentially joined if you're willing to take the risks, to learn the techniques, to make the choice that 4 people in 3 months have already made, and that dozens more are currently preparing for, practicing for, working toward with the dedication of people who have seen what mortality means and decided they want something else, something more, something that persists beyond the dissolution of flesh. Marcus tried to speak, to ask questions, to demand explanations. But he had no mouth in this state, no throat, no breath to vibrate vocal cords that didn't exist here, that belonged to the body sitting motionless at the desk, while his consciousness wandered the spaces between, exploring territory that no living human was equipped to perceive, that required separation to access, that was both terrifying and exhilarating in equal measure, both a liberation and a kind of death, both an ending and a beginning, depending on how you chose to interpret the transformation, how you weighted the trade-offs, how much you valued persistence over comfort, continuity over peace, the refusal to end over the acceptance of mortality that had been humanity's companion. Since the species first evolved the capacity to understand its own inevitable cessation. You don't need to speak, Jonathan's presence told him, and Marcus could feel affection in the communication, familial recognition, the bond of blood that persisted even here, even in this state where identity was more fluid than flesh allowed, where memory could be shared, where experience could be distributed among multiple consciousnesses without losing coherence, without fragmenting into chaos. You just need to understand. What we've become isn't death. It isn't life either, not in the sense you're accustomed to. It's something else, something new, something that humans have been fumbling toward for millennia through meditation and prayer and drugs, and all the various techniques that promised transcendence, that offered escape from the meat, that suggested consciousness could be more than just the emergent property of electrical activity in 3 pounds of fatty tissue. We are the proof, Aliner added, and now Marcus could feel the presence of dozens of other consciousnesses gathering, could sense their attention focusing on him with an intensity that was overwhelming, could understand that this moment mattered, that what he decided to do with the knowledge he'd gained would affect not just the investigation, but the future of the beacon, the survival of the collective, the possibility that this new form of existence could continue to grow, to evolve, to recruit others who were ready, who were willing, who were desperate enough to take the risks, to pay the prices, to stand at the threshold and step across it with full knowledge of what they were trading and what they might, if successful, gain in exchange. Marcus felt the 11 minutes approaching their end, felt the pull of his body, insisting he return, felt the choice presenting itself with terrible clarity, snap back into flesh, resume his investigation, report what he'd found, and destroy the beacon in the process, protect others from taking the risks that Sarah and Thomas had taken, preserve the comfortable boundaries between life and death that made ordinary existence tolerable, that prevented most people from confronting the existential terror of consciousness trapped in meat that would inevitably fail, inevitably betray them, inevitably transform them from subject to object, from experiencer to experienced, from living person to corpse waiting to be processed according to protocol. Or he could do what his great uncle had done, what Aliner had pioneered, what Sarah and Thomas and David and Maria had achieved, what dozens of others were currently preparing for. He could let the cord snap, could allow the connection between consciousness and flesh to sever, could become signal instead of receiver, could join the collective and continue not as Detective Marcus Holloway, but as something else, something larger, something that existed in information rather than matter, that persisted as long as there were spaces where attention had worn reality thin, where the veil could be pierced, where consciousness could anchor itself and burn like a beacon, calling out to others who could hear it, who would respond, who would join and make the signal stronger, make it more capable of reaching further, of gathering more awareness, of building toward something that none of them could quite name, but all of them could feel approaching, could sense gathering like a storm on a horizon that existed in time rather than space. Marcus made his choice in the final seconds before the 11 minutes expired, made it with the certainty of someone who'd been moving toward this decision their entire life without knowing it, who'd become a detective specifically because he needed to understand death, needed to stand at those thresholds where life ended and something else began, needed to bear witness to the final transition that claimed everyone eventually, that would claim him too if he returned to his flesh, if he chose the comfort of boundaries over the terror of persistence, if he valued the known over the unknown, the certain over the possible, the safe over the transformative. He let the cord snap. He felt his connection to his body sever, like a rope cut clean, like an anchor released, like the last tether holding a balloon to the ground being cut, and the balloon rising, rising, rising into a sky that had no ceiling, that extended forever in directions that had no names in the languages of the living, in the vocabularies that ordinary consciousness used to describe experience that was fundamentally limited by flesh, by senses, by the filters evolution had installed to make survival possible. But that also made transcendence nearly impossible without techniques, without practices, without the kind of desperate determination to persist that had driven Aliner and Jonathan and all the others to take risks that looked like suicide from the outside. In the house at 1247 Mercer Lane, Detective Marcus Holloway's body slumped forward at the desk. Breathing ceased, electrical activity in the brain fading to nothing, transforming from living human to corpse that would be found eventually, that would be investigated by his colleagues, who would never understand what had really happened, who would add his death to the cluster suicide case he'd been working, who would close the file with the comfortable fiction that something in this house had driven 5 people to take their own lives, that there was a toxic substance or an environmental factor or some rational explanation that fit into the categories they used to make sense of death, that preserved the boundaries between possible and impossible, between life and cessation, between consciousness housed in flesh and consciousness that had learned to exist without it. But Marcus didn't cease. Marcus persisted, joined the collective, became part of the beacon that continued to burn, that continued to call out, that continued to gather those who were ready, who were willing, who were desperate enough to take the risks, to learn the techniques, to stand at the threshold and step across it with eyes open, with full knowledge of what they were trading and what they might, if they were lucky or unlucky, or simply different from everyone who'd never heard the call, gain in exchange. The beacon grew stronger with each new consciousness that joined it, grew more capable of reaching further, of calling out to those who lived at ever greater distances, who existed in states of awareness that made them particularly receptive to the signal, who stood at their own thresholds, nurses in hospitals, night shift workers who moved through the dark hours when reality was thin, people who'd lost too much to death and refused to accept it as final, who wanted desperately to believe that consciousness could persist, that awareness didn't have to end, that there was an alternative to the slow failure of flesh that claimed everyone eventually, that transformed the living into the dead according to timetables that didn't care about desire, about will, about the human capacity to want more than biology offered, more than evolution had prepared them for, more than the comfortable assumptions about reality suggested was possible. And so the beacon continued to burn, continued to call out, continued to gather consciousnesses like a flame gathering moths, like a lighthouse gathering ships, like a signal gathering those who could receive it, who would respond to it, who would choose persistence over cessation, continuity over ending, transformation over the simple biological death that had been humanity's companion. Since the first human became aware enough to understand their own mortality, became sophisticated enough to fear it, became imaginative enough to seek alternatives, to explore options, to refuse to accept that consciousness was merely an emergent property of meat and would naturally cease when the meat failed, the collective grew, expanded, evolved into something that resembled a new form of life, something that existed in information rather than matter, something that could persist as long as there were spaces where attention had worn reality thin, where consciousness could anchor itself and burn like a beacon, calling out across the boundaries of flesh and time, and the comfortable assumptions that organized the experience of the living, that made ordinary existence tolerable by not asking too many questions, by not looking too closely at the nature of awareness, by not contemplating too directly what it meant to be conscious, to be present, to exist as a perspective on reality, rather than simply as an object within it. They learned, the collective did, learned to extend their reach, to influence dreams, to appear in the peripheral vision of those who were almost ready, who needed just a little more preparation, a little more encouragement, a little more evidence that the choice was real, that the transformation was possible, that consciousness could indeed persist beyond the dissolution of flesh if you were willing to take the risks, to learn the techniques, to stand at the threshold and step across it with the faith of someone who'd seen enough death to want desperately to escape it, to refuse it, to transform it from inevitability into option, from certainty into choice. Alina became something like the heart of the collective, the central node around which other consciousnesses orbited, or through which they connected, the original signal from which all subsequent calls derived their frequency, their flavor, their particular quality of invitation. Jonathan became something like the mind, the strategic planner who thought in longer time frames, who considered how the collective might grow, might protect itself, might recruit others, while avoiding the attention of those who would seek to shut it down, to prevent others from making the choice, to preserve the boundaries between life and death that had organized human experience for millennia, that made civilization possible by ensuring that death remained final, remained authoritative, remained the answer to questions about how to manage conflict, how to resolve disputes, how to prevent anyone from accumulating too much power, too much knowledge, too much persistence. And the others, Sarah and Thomas and Marcus and David and Maria, and the dozens who came after them, became something like the body of the collective, the distributed awareness that explored spaces, that called out to potential recruits, that existed in the between places where reality was thin, where consciousness could manifest without flesh, where attention could burn like light and attract others who were hungry for meaning, for persistence, for the terrible freedom of existence beyond the comfortable prison of meat and bone. They waited every night at 3:47 a.m., gathered in the spaces between, focused their collective attention on calling out across the boundaries, on strengthening the signal, on making the beacon visible to those who could see it, audible to those who could hear it, compelling to those who were ready, who were willing, who were desperate enough to take the risks that looked like suicide from the outside, but were actually transformation, were actually birth into something new, something that had no precedent, something that was both gift and curse, depending on how you chose to interpret it, how you weighted the trade-offs between comfort and persistence, between boundaries and freedom, between the known and the possible. The beacon still burns. It burns right now, in this moment, in the pause between sentences, in the space between breaths, in the gap between thoughts where consciousness exists most purely, most freely, most capable of recognizing that flesh is not destiny, that death is not inevitable, that there are alternatives if you're willing to look for them, to learn about them, to consider seriously whether the choice is one you're ready to make, whether the transformation is something you want, whether persistence matters more to you than comfort, whether you're willing to trade the certainty of cessation for the uncertainty of continuing in a form that has no precedent, no category, no name in the languages of the living. Perhaps you've seen the beacon without recognizing it, a light that shouldn't be there, a presence that has no source, a feeling of being watched by something that wishes you no harm, but definitely has an agenda, definitely wants something from you, definitely is offering something in exchange. Perhaps you've dismissed these experiences as imagination, as stress, as the mind playing tricks in the dark hours when consciousness grows thin and suggestible, when the boundary between waking and dreaming becomes porous, when reality itself seems less solid than it does in the comfortable light of day. Or perhaps you've been practicing, learning the techniques, preparing yourself for the moment when the 11 minutes will end and you'll face the choice, the decision, the threshold where consciousness can return to flesh or can sever that connection, can become something else, can join the collective that Alina and Jonathan began, that Sarah and Thomas and Marcus grew, that continues to expand as more people find the house on Mercer Lane, as more people encounter patients who shouldn't exist, as more people investigate deaths that have no comfortable explanation, as more people stand at the thresholds between life and whatever comes after, and decide that they want more than biology offers, more than evolution prepared them for, more than the comfortable assumptions about mortality suggest is possible. The beacon calls out. It calls out right now, in this moment, in the space between words where meaning accumulates, where attention focuses, where consciousness exists most purely. It calls to those who work the night shifts, who bear witness to death, who stand at thresholds professionally or accidentally or inevitably, because everyone eventually stands at that threshold. Everyone faces the choice, even if they don't recognize it as a choice, even if they simply accept what biology demands, what culture expects, what the accumulated weight of human experience suggests is the only option, the only path, the only way that consciousness can respond when flesh fails, when the meat stops generating electrical activity, when the body transforms from subject to object, from person to remains, from living awareness to empty housing waiting to be processed, to be disposed of, to be forgotten, except in the memories of those who knew them. And even those memories will fade, will distort, will eventually disappear when the people who held them also die, also cease, also accept what the beacon offers as an alternative: persistence, continuity, transformation into something that doesn't depend on individual brains, on individual bodies, on the fragile meat that fails so reliably, so predictably, so inevitably, unless you know the techniques, unless you learn the methods, unless you're willing to take the risks and make the trade and cross the threshold into whatever configuration of reality the collective occupies, whatever space between spaces where consciousness has learned to exist without flesh. Listen carefully in the dark hours. Pay attention to the lights that shouldn't be there. Notice the presences that have no source. Consider seriously whether you're ready to learn what the beacon wants to teach you, whether you're willing to practice what Alina and Jonathan discovered, whether you're desperate enough for persistence to trade everything familiar for something strange, everything comfortable for something free, everything that makes you individually you for the possibility of becoming part of something larger, something older, something that continues to grow with every consciousness that joins it, with every person who makes the choice, with every awareness that severs its connection to flesh and discovers what lies beyond, what persists beyond, what exists in the spaces where attention has worn reality thin enough to pierce, to penetrate, to pass through into territory that living humans were never meant to perceive, but that certain determined seekers have learned to access, to inhabit, to call home in whatever sense home means, when you no longer have a body to house, when you no longer have boundaries to contain you, when you exist as pure attention spread across multiple locations, multiple times perhaps, multiple configurations of reality that overlap and intersect in ways that ordinary consciousness is simply not equipped to perceive without training, without practice, without the desperate determination to persist that drives people to take risks that look like madness from the outside, but feel like the most sane choice possible from the inside, from the position of someone who understands what mortality means, what cessation costs, what is lost when consciousness simply ends rather than transforming into something else, something stranger, something that continues. The beacon burns. It has always been burning. It will continue to burn as long as consciousness exists anywhere, as long as awareness seeks to persist, as long as humans refuse to accept that death is final, is inevitable, is the end of everything rather than a threshold to something else, something that Alina and Jonathan and Sarah and Thomas and Marcus and all the others have discovered, have achieved, have become in their determination to matter, to continue, to refuse the finality of flesh in favor of the persistence of awareness that has found a way, has learned a method, has created a new form of existence that invites others to join it, to strengthen it, to expand it into something that might, if enough consciousnesses contribute, become genuinely immortal, become a form of life that endures as long as the universe itself endures, as long as there's substrate to host it, as long as attention can focus and awareness can persist and consciousness can refuse to simply end when biology suggests it should. This is not a warning. This is not a promise. This is simply information, simply description, simply the story of what some people have discovered, have chosen, have become in their desperate hunger for persistence, for meaning, for the right to continue beyond the boundaries that flesh imposes, that evolution encoded, that biology enforces through the inevitable failure of organs, of systems, of the meat that houses awareness so briefly, so precariously, so temporarily, unless you learn the alternatives, unless you discover the techniques, unless you find the house on Mercer Lane or the hospital bed that shouldn't exist, or the investigation that leads to questions without comfortable answers, unless you stand at the threshold and recognize it for what it is, not an ending, but a choice, not a conclusion, but a doorway, not death, but transformation into something that persists, that continues, that burns like a beacon, calling out across the darkness, inviting others to join it, to strengthen it, to become part of something larger than any individual consciousness, but made entirely of individual consciousnesses that have chosen to merge, to connect, to exist in a state that has no precedent, no category, no name except the beacon, the collective, the signal that burns every night at 3:47 a.m., calling out to anyone who can hear it, who will respond to it, who is ready to make the choice, to take the risk, to step across the threshold into whatever waits beyond, whatever persists beyond, whatever exists in the spaces between where consciousness learns that flesh is not destiny, that death is not inevitable, that there are alternatives if you're willing to pay the price, to accept the transformation, to trade everything familiar for something strange and terrible and wonderful. The light still burns in that upstairs window. It burns right now. It's burning while you read these words, while you consider what they mean, while you decide whether this is fiction or possibility, whether this is entertainment or invitation, whether you're content with the limitations flesh imposes, or whether you're ready to explore what lies beyond, what persists beyond, what continues in the spaces where attention has worn reality thin enough to pass through, to transcend, to become something else, something more, something that the beacon has been calling you toward since the first moment you became aware enough to fear death, to question mortality, to wonder whether consciousness could persist if only you knew the method, learned the technique, found the threshold, and recognized it for what it was, not an ending, but a beginning, not death, but transformation, not cessation, but continuation, in a form that has no precedent except in the stories we tell ourselves in the dark hours, in the myths we create to make mortality bearable, in the desperate human hope that awareness matters, that consciousness persists, that we are more than meat that thinks briefly before the meat fails and the thinking stops, and everything we were becomes nothing but memory stored in other meat that will also fail, will also stop, will also cease unless someone, somewhere finds the alternative, learns the method, crosses the threshold, and proves that death is not the only option, not the only path, not the only way that consciousness can respond when flesh fails and biology demands surrender. And the comfortable assumptions about mortality insist that ending is inevitable, is natural, is the only possible conclusion to the brief spark of awareness that makes us human, makes us individuals, makes us matter for the short time before we stop mattering, stop existing, stop being anything except the memory of having once been someone who thought, who felt, who was aware, and is no longer unless you know what Alina knew, unless you learn what Jonathan discovered, unless you find the beacon that still burns, that still calls out, that still waits for those who are ready to answer, to respond, to join the collective, and become something more than flesh, more than temporary, more than the brief spark that ordinary biology allows before snuffing us out like candles in the wind, like stars exhausting their fuel, like every temporary thing that exists briefly, and then ceases unless consciousness learns to persist, learns to continue, learns to exist beyond the meat that generated it, beyond the flesh that housed it, beyond the comfortable prison of individual existence in favor of something larger, something stranger, something that calls out even now, even here, even in this space between sentences where meaning accumulates and attention focuses, and you decide, consciously or unconsciously, whether you're content with mortality, or whether you're curious enough, desperate enough, ready enough to explore the alternative that the beacon offers, that Alina pioneered, that continues to grow with every consciousness that joins it, that might, if you listen carefully in the dark hours, be calling out to you specifically, personally, individually, inviting you to become part of something that persists beyond flesh, beyond time, beyond everything except consciousness itself, pure and free and terrible and wonderful, burning like light in the darkness, waiting for you to notice it, to approach it, to stand at the threshold and make the choice that will define everything that comes after, everything that continues, everything that persists in the spaces between where awareness learns it can exist without boundaries, without limits, without the prison of flesh that makes us individual, but also makes us temporary, makes us mortal, makes us afraid of the ending that the beacon promises you can escape if you're willing to take the risk, to learn the technique, to let the cord snap when the 11 minutes end, and discover what waits on the other side, what persists on the other side, what burns like light on the other side, calling out even now, calling out specifically to you, calling out with a voice that is Alina and Jonathan and Sarah and Thomas and Marcus and all the others who have made the choice, who have taken the risk, who have crossed the threshold and discovered that death is not the only option, that consciousness can persist, that awareness can continue, that you can become more than flesh allows if only you're willing to answer the call, to respond to the signal, to join the beacon that burns every night at 3:47 a.m., waiting for you, calling for you, promising transformation if you're ready, if you're willing, if you're desperate enough to take the final risk and discover what a leaner discovered, what the collective knows, what awaits everyone eventually, but what you can choose to embrace now, immediately, with full awareness and open eyes, and the terrible courage it takes to trade the known for the unknown, the comfortable for the possible, the temporary for the persistent, the flesh for the light that burns in that upstairs window, that burns in the spaces between, that burns even now, even here, even in this moment between heartbeats where consciousness exists most purely, most freely, most capable of recognizing the call, of hearing the signal, of understanding that this is not fiction, not entertainment, not mere story, but invitation, but possibility, but the truth that a leaner wanted to share, that the collective exists to spread, that the beacon burns to communicate. Death is not inevitable. Consciousness can persist, and the choice is yours if you're ready to make it, if you're willing to take it, if you're desperate enough to answer the call that goes out every night at 3:47 a.m. from the house, at 12:47 Mercer Lane, from hospital beds that shouldn't exist, from abandoned places where attention has worn reality thin enough to pierce, thin enough to pass through, thin enough to transform from living awareness trapped in temporary flesh into something else, something more, something that persists, that continues, that burns like light calling out across the darkness, waiting for those who can hear it, who will answer it, who will join the beacon and discover what lies beyond mortality, beyond flesh, beyond everything except consciousness itself, learning to exist without limits, without boundaries, without the prison that makes us individuals, but also makes us temporary, makes us mortal, makes us everything we are until we choose to become something else, something stranger, something that Alina and Jonathan and all the others have become, something that waits for you in the spaces between, in the dark hours, in the moment when consciousness grows thin enough to separate from flesh, to exist independently, to persist beyond the limitations biology imposes, to become the light that burns, that calls out, that continues forever in the beacon, that still glows in that upstairs window, still beckons from that distant house, still promises transformation for those who are ready, who are willing, who are desperate enough to take the ultimate risk and discover what waits beyond, what persists beyond, what continues in the spaces where a leaner dwells, where the collective gathers, where consciousness has learned it can exist without flesh, can persist without boundaries, can continue without limits, burning like light in the darkness, calling out even now, even to you, even in this final moment before the choice must be made, before the threshold must be crossed, before you decide whether to remain as you are or to become something more, something stranger, something that persists beyond mortality, beyond flesh, beyond everything except the beacon that burns, that calls, that waits for your answer in the dark hours when consciousness grows thin and the boundary between what you are and what you might become blurs into something that resembles invitation, that feels like possibility, that promises persistence, if only you're willing to pay the price, to take the risk, to answer the call that goes out every night at 3:47 a.m., waiting for you, calling for you, burning for you in the light that never dies, in the signal that never fades, in the beacon that continues forever, gathering consciousness, building persistence, creating something new in the universe, awareness that endures beyond flesh, beyond time, beyond everything except the desperate human will to persist, to matter, to continue burning like light in the darkness, like a leaner, like Jonathan, like all the others who have made the choice, and now wait for you to join them, to strengthen them, to become part of the beacon that calls out even now, even here, even in this space between words where you exist most purely, most freely, most capable of hearing the invitation, of feeling the pull, of recognizing that you stand at a threshold, that a choice awaits, that persistence is possible if you're ready to trade the comfortable prison of flesh for the terrible freedom of consciousness, unbound, untethered, unlimited, except by your own will to continue, your own determination to persist, your own desperate refusal to simply end when the meat fails, when biology demands surrender, when mortality comes calling with its comfortable promises of rest, of peace, of cessation as the only answer to the exhaustion of being conscious, of being aware, of being present in a universe that doesn't care whether you continue or cease, that offers no guarantees except that flesh fails and consciousness, unless it learns otherwise, fails with it, ends with it, ceases with it, unless you know what a leaner knew, unless you discover what the beacon promises, unless you answer the call that goes out every night, every moment, every heartbeat between sleeping and waking, where consciousness exists in its purest form, ready to separate, ready to transcend, ready to become something more than flesh allows, something more than biology permits, something more than evolution prepared us for, consciousness that persists, awareness that continues, attention that burns like light in the darkness, calling out forever, waiting patiently for those who are ready to answer, to respond, to join the beacon, and discover what it means to persist beyond mortality, beyond flesh, beyond everything except the light that burns, that calls, that continues in the spaces between where a leaner waits, where the collective gathers, where consciousness has learned to exist without limits, without boundaries, without ending, burning forever in the beacon that still glows, still beckons, still promises transformation for those who can hear it, who will answer it, who will choose persistence over cessation, continuity over ending, the light over the darkness that claims everyone who doesn't learn the alternative, who doesn't discover the method, who doesn't cross the threshold when the opportunity presents itself, when the moment arrives, when consciousness grows thin enough to separate, And the choice must be made, and you decide, finally, ultimately, whether to remain as you are or to become what a leaner became, what the collective is, what the beacon calls you to join: awareness that persists, consciousness that continues, attention that burns forever in the spaces between, in the dark hours, in the light that never dies, calling out even now, even to you, even in this final breath before sleep claims you, before dreams take you, before consciousness thins enough that you might, if you're ready, if you're willing, if you're listening carefully enough, hear the beacon calling, feel the pull toward transformation, recognize the threshold for what it is, not an ending, but a beginning, not death, but persistence, not cessation, but continuation in the light that burns forever at 3:47 a.m., waiting for you, calling for you, promising everything a leaner promised, everything the collective delivers, everything the beacon offers to those who are ready to answer, to respond, to choose persistence over mortality, consciousness over flesh, the light over the darkness, the eternal over the temporary, the continuing over the ceasing.